Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Shelter Hole. I'm Chad Garrett. I'm a guest here on the Shelter Hole with Big John G. We're actually rolling into the second episode of a really long conversation that I was able to have with my dad about some amazing things, everything from the story of Joseph to the Stamp Act to the Gracchian brothers, which we're about to get into in this episode right here, and the crux of it all coming down to how dependency leads to the true evils of the world. Hope you'll stick around and listen. I'm Chad Garrett. Here's Big John G.
So when we finished up last in the last session, we had went to Mount Sinai.
Yep.
We had just to give it a little bit of backstory. We had kind of went. If you didn't catch the first episode, I recommend that you go do that because we just don't have time to dig into all that.
Joseph and
Mount Sinai and the Israelites and why they ended up in bondage.
And we were somehow going to wrap this back around to like John Adams and the Stamp Act.
That's where we're headed now. and the reason why I did that, the reason why we went through all that with Moses and the Israelites and is because when Christ dwelt among them, and then he ascended into heaven, the people started telling Paul and Peter, hey, if we could just see a sign, if you just do a miracle. And they said, look, dude,
how many do you need?
It's not going to do any good. And you know what? It's the same thing today. People today are thinking that, hey, if we get a miracle, we'll believe. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't.
Yep.
That's just like Phil. People want to call this, that, and this a miracle, but it's something probably God did supernaturally. And again, that's theological stuff that I'm not going to get wrapped up in on this show. Not now. It's just not worth it because my show is about Jesus, and that's what I want it to be about because I know the change that He's made in my life. So when you look at somebody like Phil Robertson, and I hate to keep going back to Phil, but
I mean, his book is like literally sitting right there, so I'm not.
So let me tell you a story real quick. So when we went to church at, and I think we may have talked about this on the very first podcast we did at Christmas. Excuse me, everybody. But whenever you hadn't even been born at this time. You were born right about the time we left Greenville and Simpsonville and Southside Baptist Church. But while I was there was time that I was part of Promise Keepers and I was heading up the men's group there at the church, and we had an awesome men's group. And in my group, one of the guys was MacDonald. And he said he had 3 girls, but he said if he ever had a boy, he'd name him Ronald MacDonald. So he did. But anyway, so to give you a little bit of backstory on Mac.
You guys almost named me Levi, and you guys thought that was bad.
Yeah. So Mac actually rode with the Hells Angels and ended up doing.
You told me about this guy.
So
this is cool.
Mac did 18 years hard time for drug and gun trafficking. So somebody won him over to the Lord. Now you think about this. Here's a guy, a hard dude, rides with the Hells Angels.
Literally done time. Almost 20 years of time.
And so 3 beautiful kids.
In certain ways, he could have retired from prison.
He would take his shirt off his back and give it to you. I mean, the man was amazing.
I'm glad that you finished that statement because for a second there, whenever you were talking about taking somebody's shirt off, I'm like, this conversation went in a really weird place.
So when we had the wake-up call there at Evangel Cathedral in Spartanburg that year, Ben Birdsong, may God rest his soul, I just found out that he actually died not too long ago. His radio actually took that. I had a little vision of having something at the church, and it ended up just going crazy, and we ended up with over 5,000 guys at Evangel Cathedral when it was all said and done. It wasn't because of me. But Ben said, they asked, because we had a committee and a group of guys that put all that together, everybody had responsibilities. And we wanted to have 2 testimonies, or at least one. And Ben said, "What about John? He could give a testimony about how all this came together." I said, "No." I said, I don't want anything on the stage. I was never in front of the cameras or up on stage at any time.
Yeah.
I sat up front. I did take that. I did sit up right in the front row. So I said, let me ask Mac if he'll give his testimony. And he did.
Wow.
And that man stood up on the stage with tears rolling down his face and looked at me and told me that he loved me. I'll never forget that.
That's awesome.
I'll never forget that. So then whenever you think about, and I tell that because you look at a Phil Robertson that lived the 20-some years of his life, 25, 28 years of his life as a hellion. I mean, just wreaking havoc on his life and the life of his family and the people around him, running from the law. God put him on his face. And he pulled up in the parking lot where Miss Kay was because he'd kicked him out of the house at this time. Pulled up in his Jeep, and she had just come back from eating lunch or eating dinner with one of her workmates, with one of the ladies she works with. She said, "Don't go over there." She said, "You go on inside. I'm gonna go over." And when Kay went over, Phil had a hold of the steering wheel, and alligator tears were running down his face. And he said, "I want to come home." So he went to the pastor and did some work with the pastor and did some study. And next thing you know, the pastor makes a phone call, or somebody did to them, and said, "You got to get over here. Phil's getting ready to be baptized." And when they got there, Alan and Jace was there with Kay. I don't know if Willie was on. Willie may have been born at that time. But they in the book, it said the boys were standing with Miss Kay and they were crying because their daddy had been saved. Now, and Phil will tell you, and even Kay and the rest of them, there were rough points. There were rough times in the road through that. And I say that to say this. So you look, and I'm building on something here. So then you go to Paul on the road to Emmaus. Christ puts him on his face and says, "Paul, why are you persecuting my people?" Or Saul, why are you persecuting my people? Why are you persecuting me?
He says,
me.
Why are you? Yeah, he comes in. He's like,
So,
I take this personally.
Right, and that's going to be a story for another day. So I just wanted to say that. So then I look at what he's done in my life, and I know what he's done in my life. And
you want to see God, prepare to see the floor. That's something that I want to say, because he has a real good knack about putting people on their face.
So I told Casey, one of the guys I met at work, one of my customers, I don't want to give his last name without his permission. And so anyway, in our conversation the other day, it just happened to come up, and he was talking about his grandmother, and she said, "Son, when you take your shoes off at night, make sure you push them way under your bed, as far under your bed as you can get them." He said, "Mama, why I want to do that?" She said, "Because then you got to get on your knees to get them." Every morning, get on your knees is what she was saying, and pray to God and give him thanks. So, so then we come into, now we're going to go to the Stamp Act.
Yeah.
So I started reading about John Adams, and he's from Massachusetts. He'd never been further south than basically New York or Philadelphia area.
Yeah. Also not a super effective president. Great guy, but not a super effective president.
And just reading about, back then they didn't have telephones.
Yep.
They didn't have. They
didn't have telegram yet.
They had letters. That's all they wrote. Letters and books. So then it come upon them. You know, they were ruled by King George, and then King George III came in, and then he wanted to tax them. And that tax was known as the Stamp Act. And what that did is King George was putting a tax on the American people to pay for the run-up of the cost of the French and Indian War, and then there was also a war in Canada somewhere that they were trying. That
was the French and Indian War.
It
was way up north.
So he was trying to pay for that, and they said, "Oh, no." Long story short.
Fun fact. Did you know that the French and Indian War was started because of George Washington?
I didn't know that.
Young Lieutenant George Washington made a very critical mistake, and because of his mistake, it started the French and Indian War. We'll have to get into that another time. That's a little extra tidbit for you. It's a pretty wild ride. It shows that even he made mistakes in his early days before he learned to be the commander in chief that he ended up being.
So, one of these podcasts, once I get through that book, I didn't mark it through the first chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter and a half. I didn't start marking it, but I have started marking it now so that I can go back through it, because there's things that I really want to talk about that's said. And through reading that book, it just dawned on me that they are dealing with the same issues, physically and spiritually. If you read in the book of Acts, the first few chapters of the book of Acts, you'd think you was reading about now, today's times, right now. You'd think you'd be, You're
not the first person that I've heard say that.
It's amazing. I mean, I was like, oh my, I told your mom, I said, this is like reading about current events today. So Casey and I had the conversation. I told Casey, I said, Casey, the only difference between then and now is they were riding chariots and had swords and bow and arrows. Today we've got cars and nuclear weapons and airplanes.
Yep. Well,
it's the same issue.
I would still argue that they got the opportunity to walk with the Lord. We haven't gotten that opportunity.
But I'm just saying,
minor jealousy.
Well, I'm just saying, even if you look back, look back in the time of Noah, even if you look at, even what I was reading, you read in the book of Acts and then what the church is dealing with through the New Testament. Then you go back and you look, 1,760 some days later after Christ's death, because our date stamp is still upon his death. Mm-hmm. Whether they like it or not, they'll never be able to change that. So
they're trying to.
Well, they'll never be able to change it. It'll still be that date because it'll always have to be based off something. So
yeah.
Anyway,
Anno Domini.
So when you look at it, in that realm or in that fact, it's like the same issues keep coming up. And the reason why I said what I did about writing that stuff down is we forget. We have a tendency, we have such a short memory.
Yeah.
That's just like the Corinthians, or just all the church in the New Testament. Think about it. So they all, I hate to say this, I hope God doesn't get mad at me, but I am very thankful that the Israelites and the Hebrews and the Jews rejected him. And he told Paul, he said, go to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
Because now I'm here.
Yep.
And so when you look at how, when you look at how the times of yesteryear are tied in with the times of today, what's our government trying to do today?
A lot of things. Very few of which I actually
One of the
agree with.
things that they're trying to do is they're trying to control us.
Yep. Yep.
And how do you control us is by making us dependent on them. So just like, here's the way I see it. Pharaoh, and here's why I said it. Pharaoh was so worried about being overthrown by the Israelites, by the Hebrews, and that they would take up arms with somebody else to overthrow them. Look at what they're doing today. Now they tried
to make him dependent. So Pharaoh tried to make so first of all, Joseph helped Pharaoh make the Egyptian people dependent on Pharaoh. And right. Now, and then Pharaoh turned around and said, oh, you helped me get everyone else dependent on me, and now I am going to make you dependent on me, and because they are already dependent on me, they are going to agree with me in making you dependent on me.
So
dependency, yeah, that's a really good point. The dependency really drives a lot of this corruption and greed and a lot of the, what's the word I'm looking for? I lost it.
So the Christian faith that they're saying that we have hate speech. No, because what we teach, what we preach is that we need to love one another like Christ loves us.
Right.
that he says if you don't have love for your brother, then Christ is not in you.
Well, it also says love your enemy.
Oh yeah. It doesn't say you have to like him. Mm-hmm. It says you have to love him.
Right.
That's like I've told people in my last podcast, and you haven't really seen it yet because you guys haven't put it through production. But I'm sure there are times that your mother didn't like me very well.
Yeah.
She loved me, but she sure didn't like me. I can tell you that right now. It's been many a day. That woman didn't like me.
Yep.
So, but if you, that's just like.
Can I take with this idea of dependency and run with it for a
Yeah,
second?
yeah.
Because
I'm going to drink coffee from that way, dude.
And I'm going to wrap this back around to the birth of Jesus Christ too, because this is really cool. After the time period in the dark period of the Israelites, right? After the times of Elijah, after the end of the Old Testament, leading into the New Testament.
Hold on to that thought right there. Let's take a quick break.
So, coming back, there's this period in Greek history called the Gracchian period. It's called the Gracchian period because it's based...
Oh, yeah, you wanted to get into this. Okay,
yeah.
Cool.
So this is the idea of these two brothers, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius was the older brother. Gaius was the younger brother. Tiberius was the level-headed, well-spoken, very confident and loquacious and eloquent brother, whereas Gaius was the very fiery and spirited, sort of like the Donald Trump of the Roman Republic. And leading up to the time period of the Gracchian brothers, you had a series of laws that were passed that no one paid attention to. They were similar to American immigration law, where they exist, but no one really enforces them. And these laws had to do with land ownership. And so when Rome when Scipio Africanus defeated the Carthaginians, and the Rome really began to expand. They established them. They were like, hey, we're not just a bunch of peasant farmers. We can actually be a world power. They began to expand, and the way that they wanted to expand is they started putting people in charge of land, and in order to try and make sure that the land was distributed properly, they would put a limit on how much land you could own. And this was called, one unit of land for them was called a jugera. And they would have, the maximum amount of jugera that you could have was 500 jugera. It was about 1.5 square miles of land that you could personally own. Well, the way that a lot of the gentry of that time period is known as the patrician class would get around this is by selling it to themselves and fake people, or selling it to lesser members of their family. And because the patriarchy was still very much in effect, and the men were in charge, if the man wanted to sell a piece of land to his son, the son still had to obey the father. And so there were ways around this jugera. Well, enter Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, because the plebeian class, the peasant class of this time period, also the slave class that made up a large part of the army, couldn't own land. They stopped having kids because all of the land was owned by the patricians, and the Senate was very largely controlled by the patricians. And so they didn't have enough money to have kids, so they stopped having kids, and they couldn't get any land because everybody owned all of the land. And so they decided to find these two very charismatic men that were actually of the patrician class. They were descendants of great generals, and they were war heroes in their own right. And they chose them to be the heads of the plebeian class in the Senate. And so Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, specifically Tiberius, sort of became a demagogue because he was trying to retroactively enforce laws to get the land, the jugera, to begin enforcing this law about the land that people owned. And naturally, when you try and start taking people's land away from them, land that's been owned by generations, and the people that own that land now weren't even the ones that committed the sin of breaking the law to get the land. All they know now is that they have the land. Why are you going to take my land? We weren't even the ones that did this thing. Why are you going to punish us? Like, it was our ancestors. We're not even responsible for this. Tiberius and Gaius both, they sort of tried to ram this idea through. And the reason why this is significant is because the patrician class, the reason why the plebeian class sort of tried to rise up was because the patricians had made them dependent on them to be able to live, because they had to farm their land and do all these things. Fast forward, that begins the fall of the High Republic. And you fast forward a little bit into history, and you once again see a guy named Julius Caesar. So the Senate is still around. They're still having issues with the slaves and the people and the Uyghur of land and all this stuff. And you see another wealthy, very well spoken, and a very charismatic individual, Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar was a very interesting guy. Julius Caesar used to walk past statues of Alexander the Great whenever he was in his 20s, and used to get depressed because he hadn't accomplished all of the things that Alexander the Great had accomplished, and he was so old. And so all of the things that we know Caesar for doing, he was still in this weird area where he would get a mentally despot. He would go into this period of despotism in his own mental state, because he didn't feel like he was succeeding in what he had set out to do. He wasn't succeeding in his goals in life, because he would look at the statue of Alexander the Great and all the things that he had done, and he wasn't measuring up to who Alexander was. The Senate tried to control Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was dedicated to Rome, and Julius Caesar wanted power. But it's not clear by the text and things that we have that Julius Caesar was particularly fond of the idea of turning Rome into a monarchy. He knew he wanted power. He knew he wanted to be prominent. He wanted to expand Rome, and he knew that he wanted to create something like a great empire. But it's not clear that he immediately, from an early point in his career, wanted to unseat the Senate. And instead, he ended up doing so and rebelling and causing a civil war inside of Rome, because the Senate was scared of his power. They became scared of how many people were following him. And so after he had conquered at the time what was Gaul, is now France, the Senate essentially turned against him, and were trying to get him to send his troops into stupid places, and they were trying to take his power away from him, and they were trying to not recognize him for the great conquests that he was doing, and they were trying to take all the credit away from him. And he was like, no, I'm done with this. And he told his men, like, we're going to step across this river, and when we do, we're not going back unless we conquer. And this is where we get that phraseology of the die is cast, right? That's supposedly what Julius Caesar said when he crossed the river. And the reason why Julius Caesar felt like he needed to do this was because the Senate was trying to make him and his power and his ability to be successful dependent on the Senate. So you not only see this repeated through Joseph, the Stamp Act, and the things that led our founding fathers to the Revolutionary War. You not only see this being a catalyst to the Civil War, right? Because the freeing of the slaves and the ideas of the slave trade being a huge problem, and the dependency of the Southern nobles on the slave trade in order to have their economy, right? It was it wasn't just like, we hate black people. It was like, we are going to lose our way of life if we lose this source of labor. It's actually sort of reversed. The nobles were dependent on the slave labor. Caesar was trying to be forced into dependency on the Senate for his power. It's really interesting to me. I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction now that we've sort of like highlighted how this repeats through history, right? It sort of rhymes. It's different circumstances to lead to it, but it's sort of this core of dependency that we always come back to. It's really interesting to see how the Gospels pervade even beyond the Bible. They are present. Even the meta narrative of God is around even beyond the Bible, because everything that happened with the Gracchian brothers leads to Julius Caesar. Well, Julius Caesar, when he was stabbed and killed by the Senate, gave all of his powers to a guy named Augustus. Okay, Augustus Julius Caesar, right? And so, or Augustus Octavian, or whatever his name ended up being. His name was Octavian. He became known as Augustus Caesar. That's what it is. Who became the first true emperor of Rome. And as a way of keeping power, he divided Rome into 3 subsects in which he could give ruling issues to over these people, but they all sort of had to report to him as a delegation of power, right? And one of the people that he tried to give this power to it was a toss-up between one guy and another guy. And this other guy was actually a supporter of him before he became the emperor. And this guy's name was Mark Antony. Now, I left out in Julius Caesar's story, I left out a key player because his lover, Julius Caesar was married, but his lover, his affair that he was having was actually with an Egyptian princess by the name of Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra, whenever Julius Caesar dies, actually doesn't end up going to where you think she does. She doesn't go to Augustus. Instead, who she goes to is this guy named Mark Antony. Now, Mark Antony and Cleopatra stage another civil war against Augustus. And when this happens, they get routed at a place called Actium. And Augustus or Mark Antony and Cleopatra, they are able to escape this routing, this massive defeat at the Battle of Actium. And where do they flee to? They flee to Egypt. Why is this significant? The king of the West Bank during the time period right before Jesus' birth was a guy named Herod. And Herod and Cleopatra hated each other. They dealt with each other on a regular basis because they were a part of the gentry in Rome. They hated each other. And so Herod, without Augustus's approval, never had the ability to march on Egypt, and he never really had the political means to move against Cleopatra, even though they despised each other. Cleopatra and Mark Antony fleeing to Egypt, and Egypt being removed away from Rome, became a refugee camp for Roman refugees of the Civil War. It also became the refugee area that Mark Antony and Cleopatra moved to. There's also some unrest out in Malaysia, in what we now know as the Middle East. There was some unrest there, and they had immigrants moving from there into Egypt. Where does Joseph and Mary take Jesus whenever they are fleeing Herod?
To Bethlehem. No.
They take him to Egypt.
Yeah, to Egypt.
So
That's a trick question.
Yeah, it's a trick question. So they take Jesus to Egypt. Why was Egypt a place that they could take Jesus? Because Cleopatra and Mark Antony had essentially turned Egypt into a place for refugees. So you see this entire narrative. It's because of the Gracchian period that we get Julius Caesar. It's because of Julius Caesar that we get Augustus. It's because of because of Augustus we get the Battle at Actium. It's because of the Battle at Actium that Mark Antony and Cleopatra flee to Egypt. And it is because of their fleeing to Egypt in the civil war in Rome that Egypt is a refugee place that Jesus then gets to flee to.
Wow.
And gets to be brought up in. You want to talk about the meta-narrative of God and how God lined up everything to make sure that the Savior would have a place to flee to and a place to learn and grow up and develop so that he could come back and then die for our sins. Like, that is beyond cool to me. And it's one of those things that Jesus manages to do, right, in his own life, is he manages to keep himself from being dependent on anyone. Even whenever he's young and he's 7 years old, they went to synagogue and Mary and Joseph leave and they are 2 days away before they realize that Jesus isn't around, and then they have to turn around and go back. And Mary looks at him and says, where have you been? We've been so worried. And Jesus looks at her and says, I've been at my Father's house. Where have you been?
You know, when these great conductors write the music for these film productions,
yeah,
and how they, there's times that they climax and there's times that
the crescendo and the decrescendo.
So think about the Bible
mm-hmm.
as your music and your lyrics,
mm-hmm.
and think about God, our Creator, being the orchestrator, the conductor. Can you imagine? Because there's certain parts of the Bible where it's the judges,
Leviticus.
You know what I mean?
You have Judges and you have
I mean,
Leviticus.
think about that. Isn't that awesome? I mean, that is just. I mean, when you think about what you just said, that's. I mean, I had to think about. I mean, I'm just like, it's like God being this great conductor in heaven,
and the
it's
measure
like,
that it's the
and
in those musics, in that classical music, they're called movements.
Oh yeah, there's
And
movements, all right.
And in history, what is it called whenever there's a giant time of change?
Yep.
It's called a movement.
Yep.
How cool is that? And so I think that we are to bring this back to where we're at today.
Maybe we just found the name of our
Episode?
episode.
For
the great conductor.
The great conductor. Could be.
Hey, who knows, man? The great conductor.
So I think that we're in the midst of another movement, and we did an interview with Charles Billingsley recently, and in that interview with Charles Billingsley, I asked him. I said, "Do you think that we are on the cusp of a great revival?" And he says, "Yes." He's like, every time that you see a great revival happening, it typically comes on the end of a time period of pretty significant persecution or hardship.
Oppression.
Yeah,
Oppression and persecution.
Oppression.
That's
persecution.
what's going on in Iran and China.
Yeah, with the
Afghanistan.
Well, and here's the wild thing.
Mongolia.
I don't have to agree with the Muslim faith to recognize what China is doing to the Uyghur Muslims as being evil, and yet we have an administration right now that is not willing to move or act. As a matter of fact, our president went on to TV and tried to justify the things that were happening in the Jiangxi province, but as a cultural difference and how we have to respect the cultural differences of the Chinese Communist Party.
Because what they're doing here is no different.
There are people yet. I was about to say, like, there's a big difference, and
we don't even know what bad is yet.
Yeah, no, and
But
there's no people. There is no people besides sort of what is happening with Planned Parenthood and the statistics of their locations being 80% in the black population. If there's anything that's happening like that in the United States, it's Planned Parenthood against the black populace. But even that is far divided from people being put in concentration camps and women being forced into sterility, right? Like the forced sterilization of the Uyghur women so that they don't procreate and so that they don't make more Uyghur Muslim children, right? Like that is a severe issue. The closest thing that we have to that in the United States is Planned Parenthood with and their disproportionate placing of clinics in black neighborhoods. That is an issue, but it's still far removed because a forced sterilization is very different from people voluntarily going and getting an abortion. So it's hard to even connect those two things. I pray that we never go back into something like that, but if we continue to have leaders that aren't willing to recognize evil when it is evil, whenever they are not willing to call it out and move against it, and yet are more inclined to promulgating this mentality of dependency, that is where we are going to run into an issue. And it's why what we're doing here with Forerunner Productions, with The Shelter Hole, and talking about faith and talking about these things, and the other shows that we have where we talk about the culture, where we make culture and we tell stories and we highlight through story what is evil. There is nothing more powerful than story. There is a reason why fables and mythology and story, why it all sticks with us, why telling stories from orally and then written through all of time has been so important, because that is where you can see the soul of a society. It is why Forerunner Productions, it is why the things that the Daily Wire, it is why the things that Bonfire Legend, it is why the things that The Blaze, it's why what we do is so important. Because if we don't move, if we don't act, if we don't tell better stories and talk about the very stories that are playing out before us and relate them back to the things that we have seen in the past, if we don't do this, we are destined to be damned. Hey everyone, and thank you so much for being a part of this episode of The Shelter Hole. We've had a blast having this conversation, and we're so happy that you got to be a part of it, and we want you to continue to be part of the conversation. You do that by going to forerunnerproductions.locals.com for as little as $2. That's like the cost of a Coke. You can become a part of the culture revolution. You can make your voice known and help us recapture the soul of society. Again, that's forerunnerproductions.locals.com, where we have all sorts of exclusive articles, a place for you to post the things that are heavy on your heart or that are maybe uplifting that you want to share with the community. It's an amazing place, and we have been in love with all of the interaction that we're having with our community, and we cannot wait to see you there. Again, that's forerunnerproductions.locals.com. Come join us.